Hello and welcome to episode 75 of our SAP on Azure Video Podcast. Today is January 13th, and together with Robert and Goran, we are here to talk about anything related to SAP and Microsoft. Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Hello. Hi, guys.
So today we will take another look at automated deployments. We have already talked about this in the past, about the SAP Automation Deployment Framework using GitHub and Terraform scripts that are all available on GitHub. But today we have Michael and Kimmo joining us, who will show us how they are using the SAP Automation Framework, the SAP Automation Deployment Framework via DevOps. They have prepared some demos, so I'm really looking forward to that. But as always, before we switch over to them, let's quickly take a look at some news from this week. And I want to start with Martin Pankraz, who has been very active with his private link service scenarios, where he has created a lot of blog posts. And the beautiful thing is now he has created this landing page where you can see all of these blog posts that he had created in the recent weeks. So I think this is a perfect landing page to get an overview of if you want to do something with the business technology platform.
Scroll down. Can you
the private link service?
And just to see that nice guy there, you know. I mean, just...
Well, two nice guys, right?
Two nice.
Or depend. We could be also one guy, but depends which one is the nice, you know.
Exactly.
Okay, you're derailing the discussion here, but I just wanted to highlight Martin's blog post. Actually, one thing that he just also released is yet another blog post in the series, and that's about connecting the SAP Private Link services to other databases like MySQL and MariaDB. So if you want to develop an application on the business technology platform and you have, for example, MariaDB on Azure, now Martin outlines how you can use the private link service on BTP to connect to your database on Azure. And as always, it's a very detailed blog post with all the necessary steps documented. There's also, as always, a GitHub repo with all the relevant content there. So I think just another fantastic instruction of how to get started with the private link service, and in this case, MySQL and MariaDB as an example. The next one, Robert, I think you found this and brought it up.
I think it's just additional, somehow nice way of how to integrate SAP systems with Azure services. Yeah. So it's over REST API. I mean, it's everything possible. If you have REST API, you just need somehow to point to that REST API, and that's all. Yeah. So it's very nice blog, actually a 2 parts blog, where she explained Priyanka, if I'm not mistaken, publish very nice 2 blogs how to do that and how to really connect to Azure Blob Storage and use it like normal storage. So it's very nice blog, detailed blog. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, cool. And using the cloud integration service on BTP and then calling REST services. Cool.
Yeah.
Then Goran, you also had some interesting blog posts.
Yeah, I just somehow saw this blog. If you go a little bit down, it's about installing SAP system or central services on more than 2 nodes. Actually, they're also talking here about the 3 nodes. Maybe if you can, exactly here. So it is a reflecting Windows clustering, but I can mention also the Linux SpaceMaker as well. Typically, customer would put it on a 2 nodes. Maybe that's a kind of cost optimized solution. But actually, the more nodes we have, the more there is a resiliency, right? And actually, I'm just thinking, especially if you have a 3-node cluster in the zones, you could cross actually across the 3 zones, across the 3 data center. I mean, that's kind of really a resilient solution, you know. The only point what is interesting or important, he is discussed on the Windows cluster difference between ENSA 1 and ENSA 2, Anchor Application 1 and 2. On first version, basically, you can have Anchor Application 1, that's 2. If you go a little bit up, I think it's 1. You can configure it. Yeah, stop it here. You could configure it on multiple nodes. It's not a problem, but actually you need to configure only 2 nodes between which would be replication and failover basically happen. The reason is simply those NQ replication services are always locally installed, right? For some reason. Now, if you go down with NQ replication server 2, we have NQ replication is a clustered instance as well, which is basically the same like on
question,
Linux.
Goran, would this be a chain replication or would this be kind of multi-master?
Just between two. Just it's between 2.
Okay.
NQ server and one replicator, right?
Yeah.
So NQ replication 1 is just a kind of, you need to pre-configure between which zone or which nodes you want to do it, even if you have configured in multiple.
Yeah.
On the ENSA 2, you don't have to configure it. You know, it's just it can, those 2 stuff can run on any nodes, and they can run on any node, or NQ replication can run on any node because NQ replication is clustered as well. It's not the local one, and in cluster it's configured that anti-affinity rules that these 2 central services and NQ should not run on the same node, of course, right? And on pacemaker is actually the same. So in that way, you can run on 3 or more nodes, NQ replication server 2 without any kind of special configuration, right? So just imagine, okay, put in 3 zones, or maybe in availability set, okay, it would be distributed across the 3 hosts, right? So maybe it's an interesting, if somebody is really kind of crazy about very high SLAs, that could be a way to go, right?
Cool.
And another blog is always interesting. I'm thinking, okay, this is kind of known, but the guy is talking about transport or slow transport on Windows cluster environment. And it's a known issue that, I mean, a potential issue on Windows cluster. You have this option called continuous availability, which actually is a fault-tolerant file share service. If you fail over and there's an open handle, there will all open handles will be transferred to another side. Meaning, for example, if you run transport and you do a failover there, the transfer would not be broken, right? So, but that has certain implications on performance, and some performance issue could be done. So, I mean, this is known, but the guy ran into issue. I've seen also sometimes issues, so he's a bit just discussing how to turn it on. Actually, on a newer version of Windows, it's also improved the performance here. So expectation also on the newest 2022 would be even better. But it's good to remind people they might run into some of those issues, right?
Yeah. You're right. So this is for Windows 2012 R2.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Great. Thank you. Yeah. Then I have 2 videos. One is from Doosan. So at CES 2022. I mean, it was all virtual, obviously, but there was one session with Microsoft, SAP, and Doosan about the Teams integration. So we talked about the Teams integration already in the past, and here we are talking about SuccessFactors integrated in Teams. And Doosan is actually one of the customers that that we worked with in the last few weeks, and they talked about their experience now integrating SuccessFactors in Teams, working with Microsoft, working with SAP. And just talk a little about their experience in this, which I think is really interesting, because we are getting a lot of questions from customers that are using SuccessFactors that want to integrate this in Teams, and it's great to see this statement here from Doosan. Another video that was released just last Friday is part of the Azure Friday series. There are over, I think, 700 videos in the meantime, and I had the honor to join Scott Hanselman to talk about the integration of SAP and Microsoft. So we showed there how to access an SAP system via Azure Bastion. Then we took some data in Excel. We worked with the Power Automate solution to update data, and finally we also worked in Teams. So we integrated some data in Teams and worked with the data directly from Teams. So if you have not seen it, take a look. I hope it is entertaining. Good, and then I want to close off with the blog post series from Bartosz. So he had republished his blog post on using Synapse Pipelines and OData here on the Azure Synapse block, this 8-part series that really gets you step by step, the extraction, then all the parameters, metadata store, handling large volumes of data. So really filter and select, introduction to Delta extraction, and then the final part was the SAP extractor and CDS views. So a lot of very valuable content. All the information is also available in a GitHub repo that Bartosz published here. So I think if you are looking into Synapse pipelines, if you have OData services on the SAP side, then this series is certainly something that should be interesting for you. So with this news, I think we are ready to hand over to Michael and Kimmo. Maybe, Michael, Kimmo, maybe you can start by introducing yourself. I mean, both of you were already on the show, but for those of our listeners or viewers that have not seen the shows, maybe, Michael, you can start by introducing yourself. What's your role, what you're doing? And then I'm looking forward to your demo.
Absolutely. Thanks, Holger. So my name is Michael Mergell. I'm Cloud Solution Architect for SAP on Azure. And showing with Kimmo today the Azure DevOps integration of the deployment framework, and very happy to be here and to show our baby. So Kimmo, to you.
Yeah, so hi, my name is Kimmo Forss. I'm a colleague of Goran, so we're in the same team. But currently, I'm the acting development lead for the Deployment Automation Framework. And as Michael, I'm extremely proud of what we're building. And the thing that you're showing is essentially the way that we've looked at automation is that we're building this in waves. So in the first wave of the automation, we essentially you were using Terraform, running the Terraform commands to deploy the environment. So the next maturity level was that we actually created these orchestration scripts, so that instead of running Terraform commands, we actually had a higher level of abstraction, so that you could just, when you're deploying the control plane, there was one script that you had to run. And now with the DevOps pipelines, we're taking the maturity yet another layer up. So you don't have to go and run scripts. You can actually schedule pipelines and do it that way. So this is kind of a journey where we're moving from having the robust building blocks to higher level orchestration. And then once we have this, then we will start planning what we will build next, and hopefully come back to the show and show you the next things that we're building.
Yeah, maybe ServiceNow integration or something like this. So
yes.
Totally, yeah.
By the way, Kimmo, what I see here is documentation part of the SAP on Azure documentation framework. Right.
Yes, yeah, this page is actually still, you can see in the URL, it's in the review. So we're working now in parallel. So typically the problem oftentimes is that you deliver code and then you have to scramble, I need to do documentation as well. So now we're building this in parallel, so that once we ship, that we have not just the product documentation, but also things like the hands-on lab here, so that people can actually get their hands dirty and trying it themselves. Because it's one thing to see recordings and demos, but it's a completely other thing to actually try it yourself and realize that, hey, this is actually quite straightforward.
Okay, then I think I start. Yeah. So basically, what we thought is really show you how the setup is done, because it's really in 10, maximum 15 minutes, the whole setup is done. And then basically everyone can deploy the infrastructure and even install any database, HANA database, and SAP itself. So I'm following, as you mentioned, this documentation that is currently in review, but Kimmo, as you said, in 2 weeks, we will have this released, and then it's visible. Everyone can find it in our normal SAP on Azure documentation. So here we see what we will do. So deploy a control plane and the workload zone and the software, and maybe to show a picture what this means. The control plane are basic resources that we need to be able to deploy SAP systems. The workload zone is the VNets, for example, for the SAP systems, and then the SAP system itself. So this is pipeline 1, pipeline 2, pipeline 3. And then we have pipeline 4, which is downloading the software, and we have pipeline 5, which is then actually installing, first of all, configuring OS volume groups, installing HANA database, and the SAP part. And as a prerequisite, before we can do this, what we need is actually the DevOps project to be set up front. And this is quite easy and straightforward. So there's a link to this documentation here where this is all described. And that's what I'm going to show. And it doesn't take so much. So everyone willing to do it can follow this here in the video, or jump over it if you don't need to. So, okay. So what do we need? We need to sign into the Azure DevOps. So that's then available here. And the next step is to create a project. So for now, I create the project SAP Automation 2. There are a couple of flavors here. We can make it public, enterprise, private. The most common use case will be enterprise, so that the one setting up and colleagues can actually work with it.
Yeah, and the nice thing with the enterprise approach is that this is actually then tied to your Azure Active Directory tenant. So you can just invite people the normal way. So, and it's more secure in the sense that it's not publicly open to anyone in the internet. So it's protected by Azure AD authentication.
Exactly. So I think this is now available already. The next step will be to import the code and the pipelines and everything that Kimmo, others, and myself have prepared here in many months of hard work, really. Everyone can reuse it and benefit from this. And so we have to import it from GitHub. This is done here in the repositories. Oh, sorry, it's actually done here. We import the repository.
Yeah, and one of the other added benefits of actually importing it this way is that the customers are essentially taking a snapshot in time of our repository. So that means that they'll have the code in their environment. So even if we're doing changes, those changes won't automatically trickle down to them. So they have the ability to refresh the repo at any time. So whenever we have a new release that is relevant to them, they can just run a pipeline that will update the repo with our code. So that is also one way that we're thinking about the fact that if we're introducing something that breaks things, so those things wouldn't automatically flow into the customer's environment.
Yeah. So we see the code has arrived. It's here. So what is the next step? So and then we are already at the step where we set up the actual pipelines that do the deployment. For sure, we have to do. We need a service connection to the Azure Resource Manager.
Yeah, this is so. As part of the one-time setup of the DevOps project, you need to do some level of configuration, like the importing is one step, setting up things like service connections. The service connection actually just provides us a way to say that, hey, if I'm using Azure, this is the credential that I'm using.
Yeah.
Again, so, this is a one-time activity.
Yeah. And here, please use the manual service principal setup, as we will use a service principal. So those details I won't show here because we will later on use the other repository where this is prepared, but just to show how and where. And
yeah, and the benefit here also is that all the identity activities can be controlled by customers InfoSec. So they could actually, so we have customers for whom this DevOps environment is already prepared. So it would be InfoSec that creates it. They would create the service principals. They would create the service connections. So then the SAP team that is using that DevOps environment, they don't even know the credentials. They're just actually executing those pipelines and using those services.
Yeah. So then the next step in the setup is to create variable definitions. We have two groups, and we simply have to create them here in the pipeline section in the library. And
so these are essentially like a way that we can persist attributes across the different executions. So these are parameters to the pipelines. And the nice thing with this is that you do them once and there's security assigned to them. So the customer can actually make sure that they're creating with the right level of access, etc. And also, as you can see on the screen, you could map these secrets into Azure Key Vault. So if the customer already have some of their details in an Azure Key Vault, we could consume them from there, which actually makes it quite straightforward.
Yeah.
So basically, Kimmo, I mean, we were doing internally a bit deploying and using the tool, but we were actually using the Azure those shell command line,
Cloud
right?
Shell, yeah.
Exactly. And here, okay, what I see, you are basically using the DevOps tool as a kind of automation platform,
Yes.
so to say, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So whilst Michael is creating those groups, so that's a great question, Goran. So the way that Azure DevOps actually executes tasks, it has this notion of agents. So there's two types of agents, and our deployment automation framework actually leverages both. So the normal or the simple way to use DevOps is by using what are called Microsoft hosted agents. So that's essentially a VM that gets spun up, the repository gets cloned there, it executes the deployment, and then it shuts down. So those agents are essentially kind of stateless VMs that just spin up and spin down. So the benefit with those is that you don't have to do any preparation, etc. The challenge with those is that in, for instance, for us, since we're using Terraform to do the infrastructure, and Terraform can run from the internet, so to say. So because it's using the Azure RESTful APIs to create the resources. But then when we're using Ansible to do the configuration of the VMs, Ansible will need network connectivity. And I haven't seen yet any SAP customer who would allow public access to the SAP VNets. So that's why we're using the other type of agent, which is called a private self-hosted agent, which is a VM running in the SAP or in the management VNet that has network connectivity to the VMs.
Yeah. We will come to this as well. And go on, I was thinking to answer a question as well. What we had to do before was this in the shell. You see, when you deployed it on the command line, there is a lot of typing, a lot of copy paste, and this is very error prone. So people who start using it, we saw that very often we had typos and errors that could really be avoided. And I think the DevOps approach, I mean, the control plane deployment is now with DevOps, it's one click. You run the pipeline and 2 clicks, sorry. Yeah, so instead of many information gathering and creating lengthy commands, it is becoming so easy. And also if someone runs into some troubles and a deployment fails, you have to look in many places, but here it's a graphical user interface. It's so easy to get information, and so that it can only help everyone, I think. Also those people who are very familiar with VI and command line, but I think it's still an advantage from handling perspectives. So the next point is actually now creating the pipelines. And there is a little thing on the permission side we have to do. I will show this, and then I will show how we create actually the pipeline, and then it's already finished. Yeah. So we have to go to the repositories, and we go to the here manage repositories and security. What we need to do is the pipelines will actually run. The first 3 pipelines will run on an Azure DevOps agent. But the pipeline 4 and 5, as they need connectivity to our systems, we have to have a self-hosted agent in our SAP environment that is able to connect. So we can connect with DevOps to the self-hosted agent, and this agent will connect to the SAP systems and perform Ansible commands and so on. And those pipelines, they write back information to this Azure DevOps repository. And to be able to do that, we have to add the permission to be able to write information back, and we need the contribute, right, Kimmo? The contribute is So we have to add the contribute, and then a pipeline can run and also write back information. And we will see later on what information we are talking about, and because this is really helpful information. Okay, then I think we are already at the step where we create the first pipeline. And so I will show this very briefly. I show one pipeline because we have to do this for 5 pipelines. It's already prepared, so I show it for one, and then we go to the other repository where this is prepared.
Yeah, the nice thing with the pipelines, again, they're part of the repo, and they're essentially, it's a YAML file that defines the activities that it does. So, and in our case, so since we have it in Azure DevOps, we can just choose it using
Azure
the graphical
DevOps.
user interface, but
That
you
is
could also
the
edit them manually.
Yeah, so that's we saw it is in Azure DevOps. It is in the repository sub. Sorry, I might no. That's great. It's in the repository sub automation. It is an existing pipeline because that's what we deliver from GitHub. And now very specific now for this for today we are using private preview, but in 2 weeks when we have moved it to the main branch, then you can use the main, yeah. But today I still need to use the private preview, and it's in the folder pipelines, and it's a prepare region. So that's the pipeline.
Michael, just for me, and all this content is there because we initially
Imported
it.
Correct.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. We cloned. Yeah, right. We cloned the GitHub repository.
Yeah, and can you quickly kind of look through the pipeline? We can show the guys a bit what it's built of. So essentially, like I mentioned, this is a YAML file that describes certain things. So it has a parameter section. It has then like the variables that we just created. So we're referring to those variables. And then essentially there are stages and and jobs. So essentially think of this as a scheduler that performs tasks. So then it goes and starts and does these tasks, and these tasks are then logged into Azure DevOps, and you can mine the logs and you can see exactly what went on, etc.
Yeah. So once the pipeline is now there and saved, I want to tune it a little bit. We don't want to have continuous integration triggers. That doesn't make sense for SAP system. We simply run it when we have to run it.
Yeah. So in our internal test, we actually have that because we want to make sure that when we're introducing code changes that they don't break. Yeah.
So here we go with the control plane deployment, and here we use the private preview, and so we save it. Okay. Then basically we have that in the pipeline here available, and now go to it and run. Yeah. That's it, actually. I have to jump to the other repository to show the run because we have not all the variables and so on. Yeah, that's clear. But maybe we can explain a little bit what we need to provide as well when we run it. So we have here, as you can see, I think, yeah.
Yeah,
so,
essentially, kind of like we had with the tutorial for the orchestration script. So essentially, we have 2 parameter files, and those parameter files essentially describe, in this case, the control plane, which consists of the deployment VM and the key vault, and also the SAP library. So those 2 files are actually stored in the repository as well. And so this is the same name as you see, management West Europe and deployment Dep00 infrastructure, and then there's the SAP library. So these are essentially the parameter files that we then pass into Terraform so that Terraform can create the unique deployment. So as you can see on the left-hand side, as part of the repositories, we ship a set of samples. So we have a samples folder which has workspaces. So we actually have a few examples as part of the repo. So you can really get started without any kind of manual labor. You can follow these steps and get the deployment done within an hour. You can have the first infrastructure deployed, starting from nothing. So that's actually and then once you have that structure, then what we do recommend obviously is that then the customers, when you start doing the planning, that you then also store your future parameters in the same Azure DevOps repo, because that way your infrastructure as code gets the benefit of you have version handling and everything like that.
Yeah. So now I'm switching to the repository that is prepared and ready, and let's hear the control plane deployment. Yeah, so in this example here, I was actually deploying to North Europe, And so I'm using here different. I did run this as a preparation. It runs approximately 10 minutes, as you can see. And so we will see here in the Azure portal, that's then the corresponding resource groups. And here we see from the deployer, so it's management, it's the name, North Europe, the region, the management network, VNet is department 00. And yeah, that's the deployment. Here's the deployment VM, for example, included, that we will as well use as a self-hosted deployment agent for the other pipelines. Yeah. So coming back to the resource groups, filter a bit. And the sublibrary, which is then containing the SAP binaries, is in this resource group. And here I deployed already as well the workload zone. That's the pipeline 2. I gave it a different name to change a little bit. It's sub-02 is the VNet here in this example. And that is actually here now the resource group having the SAP systems included. So it's using the same VNet from the workload zone, and the SAD that I deployed is X02. We can go into this and see here the resources. Yeah, disk, plenty of resources. And where do we have the VMs? Let me search. Yeah, and here we have the virtual machines, an application server, the HANA database, and an SCS. And coming back to the repository to show you what I did actually. So I did give the parameters here and press run, and then waited 10 minutes, and then it was deployed. The same for the workload zone. There are not so many resources, so this is faster in 4 minutes. The same, run the pipeline, provide the right reference to the configuration file. The deployer environment, in my example, it was management, but customers, partners might use a different deployer environment, so it can be provided here. And the same goes with the SAP systems then. And here, yeah, simply, okay.
Yeah, so and what we're seeing is that the deployment times tend to be very consistent. So as you can see, like this took 10 minutes, the workload zone took 5 minutes. So it's actually, like I said, in an hour, you can go from 0 to have the first infrastructure deployed.
So if I press, that's what I did. I pressed run, and then it deployed. This takes as well.
Yeah. Can you show the logs, like from one of these deployments?
Yeah. From which deployment, Kimmo?
Let's take the system deployment as well. So this is the benefit with running in DevOps. You actually can go back in time and see, like you get the Terraform output, and in Ansible we'll get the Ansible output, etc. So it makes it really easy to also validate, and especially if something goes wrong, you can actually see what went wrong. So that actually makes it quite nice. And Azure DevOps takes care of retention, so you can define policies on how long you keep runs, etc. So this gives you traceability as well.
So here we have something actually. I was here doing the download of the SAP software, and there is an error. So let's have a look.
So it ran for 1 hour and 70 minutes, and I'm guessing that's probably a SAP has updated a component, so the URL might have broken.
Yeah, okay, because I think that's also important to highlight. In the GitHub repo, obviously, there's no SAP software. So one of the steps is to use your own S user. I mean, this is just always in my specific user context, to download the software, to make it available somewhere, so that then in the next step, the scripts can use the SAP software and do the actual installation.
Yeah, absolutely. So we discussed now pipeline 1, 2, 3. We have the SAP systems deployed, and now what comes next? We have, as you say, we have to download the SAP software, and then we can do the next step. And for downloading the SAP software, we can't use an Azure DevOps agent because they are too small. These are tiny containers. It's a lot of software, so you have to download big chunk of files and then upload them to a storage account. And therefore, we are already using our self-hosted agent as well. And I don't want to show the details, just explain that we need to connect to this. So we are using, let me go back here. So we are using in the so in this management infrastructure, we have one VM. This is the deployer VM. And so we need to connect to it and configure it as a self-hosted agent. It's very easy. I won't show it, but maybe one tricky thing, we have to connect it. And as Goran mentioned, or Kimmo as well, customers don't have public IPs typically. Yeah, so it can become a little bit tricky to connect when customers try this out for the first time. They're not using their own IP ranges, and so I recommend using the Bastion. Yeah, so simply use the Bastion, and then it is really easy. You might need to set the Bastion up the first time you go through this, but this is also very easy. And the SSH key to connect to this deployment VM is in our key vault. So
nice.
So this is nice and easy to connect to it. And which one is it?
That's the problem. We have so many key vaults. So we have the keys, but we don't remember which key vault they are. So but like the Bastion thing makes life much easier. And then one thing that I wanted to mention also. So when we're using the self-hosted agent, it doesn't have a public IP. So we're not Azure DevOps cannot talk and tell the DevOps agent because there's no public IP. So the way that the DevOps agents are actually built, that it's actually the other way around. So the Azure, the agent goes and asks, is there something for me to do? Is there something for me to do? Is there something for me to do? And then when there is, it executes. So that way we can have, in a secure fashion, we have the Azure DevOps agent running without public IP, but it talks back to Azure DevOps. So that does mean that the customer will need to open their firewall so that the DevOps agent can talk back to Azure DevOps. But it's outbound internet.
Yeah. The good thing is on the deployment agent, we have already all the tools installed, and there's also the GitHub downloaded, so we can run here a script that we have prepared to set up the DevOps agent. I did this already up front, so we can't do it now here, but you can see it's already configured and we have a script, so this is easily done. And this gives us then the our self-hosted deployment agent in our SAP subscription, and then we can run pipeline 4 and 5. So I had an error in mine, which I need to look later into it. So Kimmo, I think it's now up to you. You can show the pipeline 4 and 5. Yeah.
Sure.
Cool. Thank you, Michael.
So can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So essentially, this is the same process, but this is our dev environment. So this is where we've been running this for quite a long while already. So essentially the pipelines here, so if we look first at the software download pipeline. So again, the same way that you would run any other pipeline, essentially we just say, hey, I was doing a test and to see how it works against a new environment in Australia. So let me show you what that pipeline looks like. So essentially the pipelines are very similar to anything. So there's a preparation step that essentially clones and updates the parameters to the agent, and then it runs the actual software download. So
Kimmo, can you increase the size a little or zoom in a little maybe? Yes. Because I think it's really hard to see.
Yeah, sorry, it's my wife's 4K monitor, so.
Yeah,
better now?
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, perfect, yeah.
Yeah, so essentially like the pipeline will talk with the DevOps agent, and essentially then it grabs the S user, etc. from Key Vault, and then it talks to SAP, and then it starts to validate and sees. It goes and downloads the way that our downloader is done. It's faster to check the storage account than it is to download the file from SAP. So the downloader will see, have we already downloaded this file? If we have, then we won't download it. Okay. And so then it goes through the bill of materials and then validates each file. And we actually also use the checksums for these files. So that means that we can validate that if a rogue agent would be able to upload a dangerous SAP exe blah, blah, blah. And if the checksum doesn't match what's in the BOM, our download we would notify that. So that's a way that we added additional security. And so essentially this runs for a while, and then the net result from there is that we will have the software downloaded into the SAP library into a storage account. So the way that we're using the software download is that we're actually collapsing all of the software into the same storage account, because SAP has unique names for the files. So there's no risk that we would overwrite something that is used by something else. So that's why we can also minimize the storage cost, so we don't save multiple copies of the same file. So essentially, the end result of that download is that we will have a storage account which has then all of the files downloaded, and that means that we will have the full control on our side.
Yeah, but Kimmo, I mean, for the SAP installer, you need to have an SAP files, different one. And then you need to know which one of different products would need a different set of files.
Yes.
And all those information you have in this BOM bill of materials file, and basically through that provided as user, you would automatically download the needed file without a user needing to know which one exactly.
Correct.
They don't have
Yes,
it here, right?
Exactly. So if I look at the way that we define the software, it's like you said, we have these bill of material files, which are part of the repo. And essentially, if we look, for instance, so these are the ones that we're now currently working on in purpose. So we're working on Oracle and also Windows and DB2 based bills of materials. But if we look at the one that we just deployed, essentially the bill of materials file has the relevant data that we need for the installation. So the name of the product IDs, because we need these when we're running SAP Inst in a silent installation mode. And then, like I said, we have the list of files. So the customer, the only thing that they need to know is actually which application do I want to install. So it's the BOM name. And essentially, so if we go back to the pipelines, so once we've downloaded all of the software, we would then move into the fifth pipeline, which is the configuration and the installation pipeline. So this has multiple steps. So the way that we've created our playbooks is that we're doing steps in sequence. So let me actually open the same Australian one that I use. So essentially, these are the steps that we do when we're running the full installation. So we have the core operating system step, which will actually go and do
OS patching, yeah. And
OS
install,
patching,
yeah.
and so you can, and like with the Terraform, we can actually go through and see the steps that Ansible did. So like we're going through and saying that are the repos registered, etc., making sure that all the packages that in this case, we were deploying on Zeus 12 SP5, so that we have all the right packages. So you get the full traceability, so you can see everything that we did, doing the disk configuration, etc., Crony. So that is kind of the core. So in our case, this took like 2.5 minutes, and then the next step is actually doing the SAP specific OS settings. So this would be things like creating the mount points, creating the file systems, etc. So again, we have the ability, we can see that the full traceability, and if something would go wrong, we could see here what was the step that failed. So that's the second step. This one takes a bit longer. So this one will actually make the software available from that storage account onto the central services instance, from where we actually share it out via NFS. So this takes, in our case, this took 14 minutes, and this actually goes and then downloads the files that we need. So like the kernel, the database exports, etc. And here you can see we have the checksum. So we're doing the validation that, hey, that no one has tampered with this. Once we have the software, then the next step is actually to install HANA, and 9 minutes, 13 seconds. So this actually goes then and creates the unique username for this SID and stores that username in the key vault, and then it installs the HANA instance. So it goes and runs HTTP LCM, and then you could also see here how long it took, etc. And then we get the normal Ansible report. So in the installation, the longest running task was actually to install HANA. It took 6 minutes. 9 minutes. And
Kimmo, you mentioned HANA here, but I think on GitHub you also have scripts for Oracle and
correct.
Others.
Yes. Yeah. So the way that So if I take one step back, so the way that these playbooks are written, so the steps will be the same regardless of the database. So we, instead of having an HANA playbook, an Oracle playbook, DB2, we actually have a playbook that understands which database is being installed. Yep. So that is the way that we can simplify the pipeline. So the same pipeline, and the same goes for HA. So actually the pipeline knows that this is an HA deployment, and if it's an HA deployment, it goes and configures SageMaker. So you don't have to worry about, you just run the playbook and it actually does everything that's needed. So 10 minutes, DSCS, 3.5 minutes, database load, 35 minutes, the primary application server. So this is, again, in this case, I didn't have any application server, so that it ran it, but there's nothing to run. So, but there's still the validations. And then what we are adding now is that as part of the deployment, we also want to make sure that we can capture not just the Ansible logs, because if I go back here and let's take a look at the SCS installation. So here we will only actually see what Ansible tells us. So in our case, we will see that it goes and executes, it validates the bill of materials, and then it goes and checks if it will be HA, it would install. But then it just runs SAP inst, so it doesn't really provide us any SAP specific log information. So what we're currently working on, or what I've been working on the last few days, is a way to actually capture the relevant SAP logs and also bring them back into the repo. So let me see if this is visible. So this is a run that I was just doing where we are. This is probably quite small, but let me see. Yeah. If I just do, so what we're doing as part of the deployment is that we're capturing the log files, the SAP log files for the different steps. So we will have the SCS installation, the SAP inst dev log, the same thing for ERS, the HDB for the HANA installation, we will have the log files, and we will take these files and promote them back to the repo. So coming back, the reason why we need to have, the agent needs to have contribute rights back to the repo is so that we can take these log files that we created and push them back to the repo. So for troubleshooting, the basis team don't need to actually SSH in to the SAS or DBbox. They can actually just look at the logs directly from there. So this is one of the things where we're actually driving for operational excellence and actually making it easier to troubleshoot and find things.
So then in Azure DevOps, you have all the information. You have the
the
scripts here, obviously, all the direct output that you get from Ansible. But then on top of that, you'll fetch the installation files that are created when I run SAP Inst, for example, and you will promote these back into Azure DevOps so that I, as the Azure DevOps user, have all the relevant information here visible to me.
Yeah, and also what we're doing, this is something that we're working on, is that once we run it, we're actually creating also a markdown file as part of it, because once we've deployed it, so the question that folks have, so okay, we've deployed the SAP system, how do I access it? And like what's the IP? So this is an early draft where we will essentially have an output from the Ansible deployment saying, hey, this is the system, this is the SID, we're using this, and then this is the IP for your SCS, and your credentials are stored in this key vault within this secret. So then you can get all the data, and then you can just log on to the system and continue doing the work. So these two pipelines, like Michael mentioned, are the ones that we actually need to have the DevOps agent, because we're running them directly on our DevOps agent.
Cool. I think that's a very, very nice end-to-end story, and it definitely, I think it will definitely simplify the way, because similar like Goran, I also participated in the in some of the exercises where we had to use all the scripts where we needed to connect to a shell, which I don't mind typically, but there's a lot of things that you need to input. There are a lot of things that you need to monitor while running the scripts, and here I prepare the variable once, I run the pipelines, and then I have all the logs very easily accessible to me. So I think that's a really nice scenario.
Kimmo, could you schedule it as well, the pipelines?
Yes.
Multiple.
Yeah. So pipelines can be triggered like we've been doing it from here, like running them manually. They can be scheduled. So one of the things that we're looking at doing for operational excellence, again, is that we could essentially run the Terraform pipeline, let's say, on a monthly basis, and to detect drift. So because essentially what the parameter file, so if I look at let's say, take the Australian example. So if I look at so this is the desired state, so this is how it should look like. And then, but someone may have gone into the portal and done some things, etc. So we could run this on a weekly or monthly basis and say, hey, actually, something has changed. So we can detect drift that way. So that way we can also kind of, from a governance point of view, help keeping things in shape. And this is an example where, like, I've just uploaded one of the log files. So this would actually give us everything in one place. So the infrastructure configuration, and then the pertinent parameters that we need for SAP application, which application am I installing, what is my FQDN, in which key vault do I store my secrets, etc. What's the SAP SID, what's the database SID, what's the platform, etc. So again, this is, like I said in a minute, so this is our main goal with this is to lower the threshold of starting to use our automation framework. So moving from the scripts to this will actually make it much easier. And the nice thing with these pipelines, like Michael already alluded to, is that since they are in DevOps, we can start doing integration. So like we could actually think of a scenario where you have a ServiceNow workflow where you're defining your SAP system, you get the approvals in ServiceNow that triggers off the pipelines, and then we get the outcome that we want.
Cool. So I think the most important question is, when will this be available? When can we use it?
So
it can be used now. So it's in public preview. You can use it now in the private preview branch.
Yeah, it's available. So the way that we're working in the repo is that this is we've moved to the new repo, so we have the GitHub Azure SAP Automation, and in difference, like in the old repo, we actually had a lot of branches. Here we actually only have 2 branches. So the private preview one, which actually already today has these pipelines. So you go to the deploy pipeline. So these are the pipelines. So essentially they're already, so you can use them here. Right. But the goal that we have that within January, so within the next 2 weeks. So these have been here already for quite a while, and we've been running daily builds of the infrastructure now for a month. So we're now just doing the final polishing of adding the markdown files, etc. But by end of month, our goal is to actually push the pipelines and the documentation up to the main branch, and then the documentation to docs.azure.com.
Cool. I think that's really great. And I'm sure this will help a lot of customers to get started and install an SAP system, or even partners that can leverage this and modify it according to their requirements, and then use it to install SAP systems.
Yes, and like all the same capabilities. So even though we're running it from a pipeline, all the same capabilities that you have if you want to have your own custom naming convention, that applies here as well if you have custom disk sizing. So we're not losing anything by moving to DevOps. In fact, we're gaining the logs, we're gaining the UX, and we're also gaining like the enterprise credentials so that the DevOps repository is protected by Azure AD, which a lot of customers tend to be a bit skeptic on public GitHub for internal things. So our goal is essentially to say, hey, you can use Azure DevOps for your configuration and then just our code from there. So then everything is kind of in the same secure bubble, so to say.
Cool.
Really
and
great.
How much time, let's say, S/4HANA installation takes time, in average, your experience for both of you?
So if let me actually, it
was an hour or so.
Yes, roughly an hour.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if I go back to, let's go to the pipelines and look a bit at. It's quite consistent. So it's typically an hour. Then, of course, these are empty environments. So if you would have if you're doing a migration and you have a big database, then the database load would, of course, take a longer time. But it's typically quite consistent. So if I look at the one that I did, the Australian one was an HA deployment, and it took an hour and 17 minutes.
Cool.
And then, so this one, which took 3 minutes, this would be a run where you just run, and it's already deployed. So kind of showing the item policy that we can rerun the playbooks, and they can remediate if there's things. But here's another one where you see an hour 16. So roughly like an HA deployment, 75 minutes, and non-HA deployment like an hour or so.
So you save some kind of 1 month of time per system, I guess.
Well,
more.
Yeah, ultimately, yes. The first few times that you do it, it probably takes longer because like the setting up the DevOps and doing the first TF-var files. So, but then the more systems, the more benefits. So when you do your third or fourth or fifth system, then it starts to become really a rapid activity.
Cool. I just want to highlight one last thing that you briefly mentioned, which I think is also really important. So this is not only for fresh systems, but the Terraform and Ansible scripts actually provide you with the flexibility that I can take my own database export and use this for the installation, and then not only have a blank system, but really a system that maybe comes from a previous export that I did.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. So in the new system, if I look at the bill of materials, essentially this is your database export. So you could replace this with an export of an existing system. Then you would just deploy and import that.
Yeah. Great.
Okay.
Good. No, I think, Michael, Kimmo, I think that was a great update on the SAP Automation Deployment Framework with DevOps. And I'm sure we'll see more and more. I'm really looking forward to the official public preview with the documentation. And I'm sure we'll have lots of customers using this. Thanks. And I'm sure we'll see you again sometimes in the future in one of our next podcasts.
Yeah, we hope to.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.